Alright everybody, hello. Today I've got another little bit of a review for you for a short, it's called a novelette, in the first issue of Weird Tales. I read this a little bit, I read this last week and I thought it was pretty decent. It's not great, but it's a good story, worth taking a look at. It's the story that actually was featured on the cover of the first issue of Weird Tales. So, it's called OOZE, and it's not called The OOZE, and it's not called The Blob, but you might have thought of those titles when I say that the name of the story is OOZE. I don't think it's actually related to either of those tales, either of those other stories that were later made into movies and stuff, but this is actually a lot more, well, let's start off with the author. The author's name is Anthony M. Rudd, and it is the second story in the first issue of Weird Tales. Now, this story is very reminiscent of, actually, Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror. Now, of course, Lovecraft would write The Dunwich Horror much later than this. This was published in 1923. The Dunwich Horror was published in 1929, 6 years later. However, this story is not, a shot-for-shot remake or pre-remake of The Dunwich Horror. It's got a much more scientific and reporter-esque tone than occult. It's actually got a little bit more like human interest to it, where the story is basically this guy who's a reporter going around and trying to figure out what happened. I'll get to that in a minute. But in the course of this, he's more interested in what happened to the people who were killed and or went nuts, and he interacts with various people in the area. And he himself is a character who's not, the thing about the Dunwich Horror is that you get that long period where where Lovecraft is talking about, what's the character's name? I forget the character's name, but he's the kind of the main character of the story in a sense, where most of the story is about this goatish child and his growth and interest in the occult and the stuff that he's doing. This story is written from the perspective of a reporter or a writer of short fact articles who basically he had a roommate in college, and this roommate's name was Lee Cranmer. And Lee Cranmer is the son of a scientist who's independently wealthy named John Corliss Cranmer. And what basically happened, in the past is that I believe the story is, written 6 years after the events that transpired, right? Where John Corliss Cranmer basically shows up in town one day. He basically went and built a house in Alabama, in the swamps of Alabama. He went there to just kind of, do his own stuff. He's independently wealthy, no big deal. He's just kind of do his own stuff. But then, a few years later, there's a bunch of, weird events that, happened around there. And that area has gotten a bad reputation. But basically, what happened is that John Corliss Cranmer killed Lee Cranmer and Peggy, Lee's wife, and basically went nuts. And he just showed up in town, and he, they were going to institutionalize him, and then he went nuts, and he ran back into the swamps and vanished, never to be seen again. So, the main character, who I don't believe is actually named throughout the story, is basically going down into Alabama to figure out, what the hell happened. And so, this story is about half as long as the Dunwich Horror. It's similar in length, a little bit longer than the Dead Man's Tale. Just to give some general kind of, perspective on it, the style is solidly descriptive. It's a little judgmental of local peoples and customs, which is to be expected, but also it's the kind of thing that people nowadays would pick up on and be like, blah, blah, blah. I'd say that the writing is of average complexity. There's no huge Lovecraftian paragraphs. There's not really a whole lot of that super short clipped style. It's pretty normal as far as prose goes. It's very descriptive. There's lots of sensory words in the description. There's a little bit of dialogue here and there. It's moderate. It's reasonably written. But it's mostly kind of a report style. I went here and I did these things, and here's what I discovered. While still being very descriptive, you're kind of over the shoulder while he's describing things that were happening while he was looking at stuff. And also we get some descriptions from other characters that are, they're detailed, I guess is the way to put it. Sometimes Lovecraft gets into that place where he's almost writing poetry, right? There's no poeticness really in the writing of this. It's very much kind of newspaper reporter kind of style. There's lots of, that said, there's lots of like em dashes and italicization for emphasis, and the flow is pretty good. The story has consistent pacing and a fairly good climax. So, again, making the contrast with Dunwich Horror, we have, in the Dunwich Horror, we have a decadent family living in rural New England. In this story, we have a mad scientist living in decadent swamps of Alabama. So the POV character is going down to Alabama kind of in search of answers. And, the story is kind of just a relatively well-done description of him trying to find out what events transpired and what actually happened. Because, he's surprised that John Corliss Kramer went nuts. And he's even more surprised that even if John Corliss Kramer went nuts, that he would kill Lee and Peggy. And so he's trying to figure out what exactly happened. And so that involves him going to visit this old house. And when he gets there, he finds that it's been fortified. And it's not exactly clear when that fortification happened, but like it was fortified, and then the fortifications were kind of ruined. One of the walls has collapsed inward, and the others are kind of bowed outward, but not collapsed, not to the point where they actually collapsed. He has to go around to the different police stations. He has to find local sources, local help to figure out, what happened when, what happened here, what happened there, why, where did this fortification come from? This wasn't here the last time I heard about. Why is this house called the Dead House? And what ends up happening is that the story is, I would say it's not particularly hard to predict. You'll probably see the keywords that kind of, give things away at some point, and be like, oh, that's probably it. But at the same time, the way that it develops is fairly interesting. It was a good read, not too long, right? The Dead Man's Tale was... the Dead Man's Tale took me a long time to read it aloud, but if you're just sitting there reading it silently, the OOZE is not that particularly long of a story. But it ends pretty well. There's kind of a reveal, and then there's a secondary reveal, which is kind of fun. It's a pretty good story. I can see why it got the cover story of Weird Tales, because it has that kind of atmosphere while also having some good action and some good kind of some fast-paced bits here and there that are fun to read and interesting. And it does have a really good kind of sense of like this guy is a reporter, but he's not a reporter from Alabama, and so he's very judgmental of the locals in a lot of ways. He talks about how he buys moonshine from them. And then, he'll just basically... He's only buying it so that they'll think that he's kind of a good guy. And then he just immediately pours it out. Or, when he's, kind of asked to sit with guys and drink with them, he's like, oh, I'll pretend to drink it, blah, 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 blah. It's, 1923, right, was still... I'm pretty sure Prohibition was still... Well, I'd have to go look this up. But, Prohibition ended in 33, 34? And it existed for a pretty significant amount of time before that. But even if this was before Prohibition began, there still was a strong kind of moralistic thread going through various parts of the country, which kind of explain why this guy has so much disdain for these people and their pure con shinny, I think is what they call it, or what he says that they called it. Anyway, it's a fun little story, good quick read. I will put a link in the description so you can go read it yourself. Just click it and you'll get straight to archive.org on the right page, hopefully. And fun story. Kind of fun to read this and then to read the Dunwich Horror, and kind of compare and contrast them. So that's fun too. But I haven't heard of Anthony M. Rudd, but he must have been fairly prolific, because not only does he get the cover story in this issue, but at the end of one of the other stories, it's advertised that he'll be writing another story for the next issue. So he must have been pretty prolific, and this is a pretty good story. More scientific than occult, but still quite a bit of fun. Anyway, that's what I've got for today. I will be working on Oh, I have a story that I'm going to do a reading of, which is kind of fun. You may remember that I did a reading of The Cask of Amontillado, or Amontillado, a little while ago. And it turns out that in the first issue of Weird Tales, there's actually someone, Charles Story, I think? His last name is Story, I'm pretty sure. But he wrote a sequel to Edgar Allan Poe's Cask. And, I figured I would do a reading of that one because it's fairly short, and that one can probably be done in one part just without me spending too much time on it. Anyway, so that's kind of the plan. I'm working on, I mentioned this last week, I didn't get to finish it, but I'm working on actually kind of a little bit of a retrospective of the Tintin comics, because these were something that I read a bunch when I was a little, not a bunch, but read some when I was a little kid, and then later on I got a whole stack of them. And so I think I'm going to do kind of like a retrospective on those at some point, which should be fun. Probably do that one in a few parts as well. I'm not sure when it'll be done, because I've got to kind of review all of these and make sure I know what I'm talking about to a certain degree, and that's taking a little bit more time than I thought it would. Anyway, have a good week, and I will see you next time.